So I'm Susan Mitchell Summers. I am a professor of history at St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania. And I am thrilled to introduce my friend, my colleague, Jim Smith-Allen. Jim is a professor emeritus from Southern Illinois University. He is one of my oldest and dearest Masonic scholarship colleagues. Jim is, he's a pioneer really in studying women in Freemasonry, and particularly women in France in Freemasonry. His most recent book is called A Civil Society, The Public Space of Freemason Women in France, 1744 to 1944. And that's the text I believe he'll be speaking from tonight. Yes.
Yep.
But he's already moved on, and his most recent work, which has yet to appear in print, is called In the Shadow of the Swastika, Life in Occupied France, 1940. It's a translation of an English translation of a French Masonic woman's expose and memoir of the German invasion and occupation of France. And I will turn this over to Jim. If you have questions while he talks, please put them into chat. Otherwise, save them for the end, and we will try to get to everybody. Jim.
Great. Thank you, Susan. That's very sweet of you. It's always a pleasure to see old friends, even if it's only online on a Zoom meeting. But, occasionally we cross paths in public meetings, scholarly meetings and the like, and most recently in Berkeley for the California Freemasons, which she helped organize. It was a stunningly well managed occasion to
Sure.
Oops, Okan, we can hear you.
Yeah, he may want to mute himself. I also want to thank Okan in particular for the rescheduled opportunity to talk. That was really very generous of him. I had agreed at an earlier time. And, I have to say, in retirement, I've lost track of how to manage my time very effectively. So I really appreciate the postponement. Well, listen, I have about 25 minutes to talk, and I want to focus on a pretty broad topic, not necessarily what all Freemasons are necessarily interested in, but a lot of historians are. And that's why Freemasonry, for me, matters historically, not just to brothers and sisters, but also to non-Masons. In fact, since the 17th century, speculative Masonry as a movement, as well as a brotherhood, has had a remarkable influence on what sociologists and political scientists call civil society. Now, that's something of a technical term for the middle ground between associational life, the third sector, if you will, positioned as it is between the private sector of the economy, better known as the business world, and the public sector of government, the nation state. Without as the theory goes, without a vital civil society, neither a capitalist economy nor a constitutional democracy works really very well. They're all mutually interdependent. Without one, the others work less well, as we see actually in the historical case of France, whose industrial economy was among the slowest in Western Europe to develop, and whose republic was among the least stable in the same period. By 1940, nearly half of France's GNP was agricultural, hard to believe, and the country had no fewer than a dozen different constitutions since the Revolution of 1789. And that's because most French historians believe its civil society was insufficiently independent of a strong centralized state under an absolutist monarch in the 1700s and under Napoleonic emperors in the 1800s, thanks to a truly burdensome bureaucracy, no matter what the regime. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, I have to confess. My book provides evidence that the French third sector was actually more of a factor than historians since Alexis de Tocqueville or Hippolyte Taine have long assumed. In the country's longest, most stable government, for example, the Third Republic, in the 70 years before World War II, it deliberately expanded civil society by guaranteeing the freedom of association. No previous regime had done that. And that's a bedrock for groups like Freemasons. You know, if you can't have that guaranteed freedom, you can't meet. You're always under police surveillance. Meanwhile, France's industrial economy did grow threefold in the same period, albeit slower than the US, Britain, and Germany. And when we add the public role of women to the mix with the creation of feminine and co-masonry beginning in the 1890s, we get a much more engaged third sector, a larger workforce, and a period of political reform instead of revolution. So here's my book's focus on the public space of Freemason women in France from the 18th to the 20th century. Yes, sisters mattered too, in an otherwise intermittent but still vital civil society in France. There in a nutshell is my thesis for the book. And that's why I titled it A Civil Society. But why did I choose to study Freemasonry in France to make this case? After all, I could have made the same point by studying the US or Sweden. I could have chosen the Rotary International or the Presbyterians instead, you know, as an associational group. But that would have been a whole lot less fun. You know, quite frankly, since childhood, I've been captivated by France, its people, its language, its history, its culture, the land of wine, women, and fashion and culture. That's why I became a French historian in the first place. But I need to explain how and why I chose to write the history of Freemasonry there, especially since as a non-Mason, I had a lot to learn about the craft. Oh my. When I began this work 25 years ago, I had never even met a Freemason, at least that I never knew, much less a Masonic sister. I had no idea women had anything to do with this fraternal organization. So like an earnest researcher, I set about reading brief histories, one about the US Masonry, Mark Tabbert, in Britain, John Hamill, and in France, Daniel Legout. These are standard surveys. I started compiling a bibliography of primary and secondary sources, which at first included no women. Well, I had yet to learn that the brethren used to say, maybe still say, at least among those I know here, that there are no women in Freemasonry, though there are Freemason women, meaning the sisters, wives, daughters of Masons. Many of them initiates of, here in the States, the Eastern Star movement. Then I discovered the work of Margaret Jacob, Yves and Giselle Hiver-Messica, François Juppot, Requiard, Jan Schnuck, Cécile Revouillet. I had to learn that Freemason women were literally everywhere. In the French versions of Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, in George Sand's novel, The Countess of von Rudolstadt, and in Leo Taxile's bizarre journalistic expose, The Devil in the 19th Century. The devil, of course, was a woman. Meanwhile, I discovered the Masonic archives in the National Library of France, confiscated by the Germans in return and posted there. The Wellsprings collection, compiled by the Jesuits, now in the Municipal Library of Lyon. And then the Russian archives of Masonic materials confiscated by the Nazis, captured by the Soviets during the Second World War, and returned to France just 20 years ago. So there was a lot of stuff there. For an organization with secrets like Freemasonry, they were very well documented for the first 250 years of its existence, at least in France. So what did I find in the sources? What did I find in the membership rolls, the logbooks, the rituals? And let me be blunt, in my naivete, it was all mumbo jumbo. For me, it was impenetrable jargon. The GOTU, tracing boards, firewater. My gosh, I had no idea what they were talking about. I found also how circumlocucious Freemason records can be. They are amazingly discreet about some real surprises, Like when one sister, Madeleine Pelletier, pulled a pistol on a brother during a heated discussion in a co-masonic lodge in 1906. It took me 5 minutes to figure out from the record that she was suspended before being expelled. But, it was, never once was the gun mentioned. Okay, all right. So similarly, the images of Freemason women in the newspapers, novels, public exposés about the craft since the 18th century were nothing less than absurd. Did sisters really worship the devil during initiation rituals? Why was there such negative commentary about all this? Now, of necessity, that last question became a chapter of its own in my book, and I won't have time to talk about it, but nevertheless, it's an interesting question. So let me walk you through a summary of my findings, and then detail a few things along the way, and then we can talk. For the period under study, it actually breaks rather neatly into 3 roughly equal time periods. From the craft's origins, at least in France, in the early 1700s, to the Revolution of 1789. That's one. Then from the Revolution to nearly the end of the 19th century, that's another. And then finally from the fin de siècle to just after World War II. And it just so happens that this is when France, as many historians would say, became modern. That is, it made a transition from absolute monarchy to a democratic republic. It also moved as an economy almost entirely dependent upon agriculture and local exchange to one far more open to industrial production and international trade. From a society of fixed order as defined at birth to a class hierarchy open to constant change. Well, that's a brutal summary of modernization theory, and it is a theory, mind you, and it's not exactly how everything lines up, but it certainly gives you an idea of the enormous sweep of change in France in the last 2 centuries. All of this occurred in tandem with the development of a fully developed civil society, one that moved from expansion in its first 70 years to some form of democratization in the 19th century, that is in the 1800s, to some form of politicization with a vengeance, where when politics was, for many of these women, a topic allowed to be discussed in the lodge. That's really stunning, and you get some interesting results as a consequence of that. Clearly, in keeping with the schema outlined by Stefan Hoffmann at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, Freemasons in the 1700s would have hardly recognized their lodges 2 centuries later. They represented entirely different worlds, even though the Grand Orient of France's oversight and the initiation rituals from entered apprentice to master mason in the French Rite remained more or less the same. But man, the chief difference is the new place of women in the craft, at least since 2010, when the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Orient of France recognized lodges' initiation of women. This was a ground-shaking event. In some ways, you can say that there are plenty of places where this is still not very comfortable. Many lodges, of course, get to choose to do exactly as they wish, and they do. They want to keep this the brotherhood. No doubt this development shocked brethren, and after all, Anderson's constitutions are very clear about this. Women cannot become Freemasons. They are not free, but dependent upon men, thus they could not be their equals in Freemasonry. All this was self-evident. Women were not brothers. Well, that was certainly the case in the 1700s when gender roles, that is how society defined the functions of men and women in the family and larger society, were inherently different. Men headed the household, women kept it. Men sired children, women bore them. Like society in general, everyone was born to his or her God-given lot in life. So there were no women in Freemasonry in the 18th century, but there were plenty of Freemason women. The women in the brothers' families were curious about what transpired in the lodge, so much so that they insisted upon having a role to play, even if it wasn't exactly what the men experienced. Hence the creation of adoption lodges with their separate and very different rituals, although they have an integrity that Jan Snook points out that is well worthy of respect and understanding, sponsored and overseen by the brethren. There were more than 60 of these lodges for more than 1,000 women on the eve of the Revolution of 1789, the largest share of them in and around, but not exclusively, to Paris. What I also found was that the higher the social status of the women, most of them were aristocrats, the further the lodges were from Paris. And there were a number in the city of Lyon, for example, in Bordeaux, Strasbourg. They were really quite extensive in their coverage, but a very large disproportionate share was in Paris. And the more their rituals were symbolic, verging on mysticism in the minor orders like the Illuminati of Avignon, the very much more influential the women were in their lodges, in their Masonic visions of what they were doing. In short, they were highly irregular, but they felt they were full participants in their own craft. So let me give you a few examples from the old regime, namely Madame Helvetius, the Princess de Lamballe, and the Comtesse de Cagliostro, three very different women. Because women were forbidden to participate in regular lodges, their involvement had to come in associations with men. In Madame Helvetius's case, it was through her husband and the lodge he established in Paris, the Nine Sisters, one of the most famous, just a year before he died in 1780. Helvetius herself was close to the brothers, who frequented her home on many social occasions, including the St. John celebrations in June of every year. Several brothers were good friends, the Marquis de Condorcet and Voltaire, the philosophers, the astronomer Jérôme Lalande, the lodge's worshipful master, and yes, our very own Benjamin Franklin, who actually proposed marriage to her. She turned him down because she couldn't quite envisage moving from Paris to Philadelphia, even though they've got a damn good baseball team, but that's all the same. Nevertheless, we know that so involved in the life of the Nine Sisters Lodge, Helvetius was effectively a Mason without apron. Princess de Lamballe did much the same, even going so far as to return to revolutionary France to support Queen Marie Antoinette and her family when they became true prisoners of the revolutionaries. While the Queen was never involved herself in Freemasonry, the closest members of her court, like Lamballe, were. In fact, Lamballe was elected as the Grand Mistress of all the adoption lodges overseen by the Scottish Rite from 1780 to 1785. There are more than 20 of them all over the country. She visited nearly every one of them. That's how seriously she took her responsibilities. Personal loyalties to her sisters, as well as to the Queen, earned Lamballe the ire of an angry mob in Paris who murdered her in the street. They reputedly cut off her head, mounted it on a pike to show the Queen. That's not brotherly love, but nevertheless, it's the end of a truly loyal and devoted member of the craft as she saw it. As for the Comtesse de Cagliostro, she was the maîtresse agissante, the efficacious mistress in the high Egyptian rite that she and her husband Alessandro created for both men and women. She was the stage manager of all the initiations, recruiting the postulants, providing all the props for the rituals, collecting the fees, dues, and donations for charity. Although she was illiterate, she knew how to count the money. According to the Marquis de Luchet, the Comtesse was a business manager of the entire order, some 5 lodges in France, not just her own in Paris. So we get an idea of the flavor of involvement of these Freemason women in old regime Freemasonry, or at least on its fringes, to the extent that we can call it Masonic. But the revolution and its Napoleonic aftermath effectively disrupted old regime Freemasonry for good. The lodges filled with privileged aristocrats were the hardest hit. Their sisters lost interest, were forced into exile, or worse, subject to the guillotine. The Grand Orient of France, headquartered in Paris, was effectively cut off from the rest of France, and the mystical side of the craft turned to less dangerous, more private pursuits. What the revolution did not disperse, the empire, that is Napoleon's regime immediately thereafter, transformed it into a pageant celebrating Napoleon and his military conquest of Europe. For the rest of the 1800s, Freemason women, with a important number of exceptions, were cut off from any semblance of the mysteries in the old regime's adoption lodges. In their stead appeared the public ceremonies promoting hearth and home, The domestic sphere of middle-class families, far from the public roles now reserved exclusively for men in politics and business and in civic organizations like Freemasonry. For several decades, there were relatively few Freemason women as defined by initiations and lodges, of and for them alone. Now their gatherings were dominated by other family members, their children especially, to ensure that the craft was no longer seen as a danger to the state or to society under a succession of unstable regimes from the First to the Third Republic, a progression interrupted by two constitutional monarchies, a first and a second Napoleonic Empire. Only do you get such a salad in French politics like that. For this reason, Freemasonry for men as well as for women really fell into irrelevance, and until it finally embraced the Republican credo of liberty, equality, and fraternity from 1848 onward, shedding along the way any outside influence of a reactionary Catholic Church in 1877. The Grand Orient of France eliminated the obligatory acknowledgement of the grand architect of the universe, so that even atheists could be Masons. Needless to say, United Grand Lodge didn't really particularly shine to that. With the firm support of the equally secular Third Republic from 1870 to 1940, Freemasonry for men thrived. In fact, the Third Republic was often called the Republic of Freemasonry. Fully one half of the deputies in 1889 were at one time or another Freemasons, while a determined faction of women and men sought to recreate adoption and mixed lodges by the end of the 19th century. So here's the story I need to finish up with. Let's look at three more Freemason women, this time in the 1800s. Josephine de Beauharnais, Napoleon Bonaparte's first wife, Maxime Fauvetti, a prominent actress in the Comédie Française in Paris, and Maria de Rem, arch-feminist and prolific journalist. Each of these women played a major role in redefining Freemasonry as it applied to women. Empress Josephine, as she became when the empire was established in 1805, was first initiated into an adoption lodge during the Revolution of 1789. I think it was 1790. And when she married Napoleon in 1797, she helped him secure the country's loyalty to what became his empire that would eventually encompass nearly all of Europe. In this capacity, she was initiated into another adoption lodge, the Imperial Lodge of Free Knights in Strasbourg. It was the most elaborate, most public Masonic ritual in French history. Hundreds of Freemasons and their families attended the ceremony in 1805 that celebrated Josephine's role as empress, of course, but also as the grand mistress of all adoption lodges the emperor had authorized, more than 100 of them. But in so doing, adoption masonry, like regular masonry, became a prop to the new Napoleonic regime. Such was the model of Masonic adoption for the rest of the century. Not a craft as we know it, but a public ceremony for other kinds of purposes than its own. Needless to say, not all women, Maxime Fauvetti least among them, subscribed to this development. Maxime and her husband Charles established the Temple for Families under the auspices of the Grand Orient of France in the 1850s and 60s. Even though they were subject to oversight by the Second Empire under Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, they created options for women to participate either in co-Masonic lodges, not very many, I think there was only one, as well as adoption Masonic lodges. There were more than a half dozen of them. And more than a dozen prominent women were involved. It lasted until the Grand Orient got wind of its irregular rituals and closed the lodge and its chapters, not before several women got the idea that there needed to be more to Freemasonry than adoption and special co-Masonic initiations. They needed to be initiated into regular lodges by authorized rituals, and they were going to not cease until they got there. Okay, here we go. Here's where Maria de Rem steps in. She knew several women in the Temple of Families, the women's activists, Jenny Dericoeur, Paul Mink, Eugénie Niboyer among them, but she thought they were seriously misguided. They were off on the wrong track. De Rem also knew brothers,
I'm sorry to interrupt, we cannot see you.
You can't see me. Ah,
Yeah,
how's that?
now we do.
Is that better? Sorry. Yep. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. She also had another good Masonic colleague, Léon Richet, who helped arrange a regular initiation into the Free Thinkers in the Grand Symbolique Scottish Lodge in 1882. Needless to say, this otherwise liberal order forced the Freethinkers to take her name off their membership rolls. So for 11 years, she was a Mason without a lodge. So she and Georges Martin created a co-masonic order of their own, Le Droit Humain, the human duty, in 1893, drawing on the Grand Orient's French Rite. Derem and Martin figured out that there were many men and women ready to participate, and they were right. After the Grand Orient and the Grande Loge of France, they were soon the largest Masonic order in the country, overtaking the co-Masonic lodges briefly sponsored by the Grand Symbolique Scottish Lodge before the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Revived adoption lodges, tentatively sponsored by the Grande Loge of France in the same period, emerged well before the outbreak of World War II in 1939. With the help of Theosophist Annie Besant, who was instrumental to the establishment of more than 400 lodges with a total of 5,000 initiates in more than 16 different countries, the Human Duty became a truly international federation, especially after it authorized the Scottish Rite rituals in 1901. Needless to say, this created considerable tension within the order because there were those who really wanted to stay truer to the secular notions or the deistic notions of Masonry, whereas the Theosophist mystical trend of Annie Besant and her followers was a significant deviation and distortion. That tension has only recently been attended to where the GATO has actually been recognized again as an important part of the ritual. 1957. Now, the revival of adoption masonry for women in the Grande Loge of France was a more modest development, even if its Freemason women are among the most politically active in France in the first half of the 20th century. There were more than 40 lodges and some 400 initiates on the eve of World War II, but its roster of sisters was impressive. Louise Michel, the elder statesman of social democracy, Hélène Briand, the courageous pacifist in World War I, and indeed she needed to be courageous. She was tried and convicted of defeatism. Marie Bonvial, the staunch advocate of women's suffrage. Remember Madeleine Pelletier, the pistol whipping character I mentioned before. She was a gender-bending champion of other women's rights. And Eliane Bro, the radical party leader on behalf of anti-fascism and children's welfare. These figures at the peak of France's civil society were joined by an equally impressive roster of activists affiliated with the Human Duty, especially the Mason without apron, Guinea Avril de Sainte-Croix, the head of the National Council of French Women, the largest women's rights federation of associations whose members totaled 140,000 by 1940. Here is one of the major points that I make about this period in French of Masonry for women. In my work, I found that Freemasonry became more than a necessary credential for men's participation in French politics. It served as an incubator for women's emancipation, second only to the National Council and its social networks of women committed to women's issues in the early 20th century, arguably the high point of the first women's rights movement in France. Much of this activity owed to these orders' tolerance for political discussions in the lodge, as I mentioned before, and many lodges like the New Jerusalem and Minerva and the Grand Lodge and numbers 1 through 4 of the Human Duty set the tone for what drew these women to join. So now, let me finish. What are we to make of this remarkable, indeed illustrious path of French Freemason women? These figures clearly embrace the stated goals of the craft in France: brotherhood, charity, wisdom that accorded them a place in French civil society. The Freemason women here did so together during the old regime, through the subsequent century of revolutionary upheaval, to the difficult and unstable period of colonial expansion, World War, and political gridlock in the last decades of the Third Republic. They served the Brotherhood and France by embodying the sociologist Emile Durkheim's conception of civic morality, of obligations to others, not just to themselves or their families. Without this express commitment within and beyond the lodge, it is hard to imagine how France could have become as liberal a republic, as open a society, or as engaged a public culture as it has become. Such, I believe, were the historical implications of French Freemason women. For so disreputable a civic organization, at least among the Catholic faithful, who were truly felt threatened by modernization, Freemasonry was actually a stabilizing historical force in France, thanks in large part to its women. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I've gone on quite long enough. But I thank you very much for your patient attention, and I look forward very much to our discussion about any things that came across your mind as I was talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was great. Okan has suggested to us that what we do is throw this open so that John Belton and Andrew Prescott can join me and Jim answering questions and asking questions, sort of an impromptu panel.
Mm-hmm.
Is this all right with you guys?
Absolutely.
John, Andrew, hello,
Yes,
everybody.
hello.
So, people, do you have questions? Do you want to just, yes. Who is that, Fahir? Or is that Peter? No, it's not Peter. Fahir is.
Okay, this is Fahir from Toronto. Jim, thank you for excellent presentation. And Susan, thank you for your moderating the call. My question would be, we see that in France, things have started way back. And how do you see the women's role in Freemasonry in France today? You know, and how is it going to look in the future? That's my concern right now.
Let me get out my crystal ball and lend it to Jim.
Well, one of the things that I have done is signed up for the Grand Orient of France's listserv. Not listserv, it's notification serve of lectures, exhibits, presentations, some of which are online for folks anywhere in the world to tune in. And I found them really very, very interesting. Several times during the year, the Grand Master of the order, this year is Georges Césarac, I believe that's how his name is pronounced, regularly issues proclamations in the honor of certain principles that are really near and dear to the Grand Orient today. And he begins with every statement on behalf of the order. To my sisters and brothers. He does so deliberately. He never mentions the brethren without mentioning the sisters. That's quite obvious. On last count, and this was, of course, a couple of years ago, the last I saw, fully 1/5 of all Masons affiliated in some way or another with a lodge overseen by the Grand Orient of France is a sister. 30,000 out of 150,000 in France. That's a pretty good number. You know, they're beginning to have a visible weight. And I suspect it, without knowing the politics of likes of this, I mean, I need to talk to some of my friends there. Pierre Moulier, the librarian at the Grand Orient Library and Archives, may very well have some ideas here. But no, I strongly suspect that it will not be long before one of the Grand Masters of the order becomes a Grande Maîtresse, a woman, to speak on behalf of the brethren and the sisters. That would mark a pretty significant shifting. Now, how long it takes to get there, I really don't know. You know, it took France any number of years to get, you know, a woman prime minister. It took, in the United States, no time whatsoever, you know, to have any woman whatsoever in the president's office. You know, but other states, you know, have managed to get there. And it would be truly symbolic about the integration of these sisters into the order. And mind you, the Grand Orient, like the United Grand Lodge of England, was a holdout for drawing the line. It says very clearly, you know, that the constitutions, women are not in Freemasonry.
No, it let some women in.
Yes, no, that's true. I have to confess.
But you can't be a woman, you have to be a man. And this, I think, is prejudice against women.
Yeah.
And the 50% of the population.
Yeah.
That was a very, I don't know whether you picked up on that controversy, Jim, but and I'd be interested to know, there's an evident thawing from UGLE in recent years, it seems to me, in its view of the women's orders. And I'd be interested in John's take on that. But I don't know whether you picked up, Jim, that trans women, men becoming women, are allowed into lodges in England. This caused some considerable ruckus in recent years when a ruling was made to that effect.
Yes, because the members were not consulted at all.
Yeah. But there seems to me definitely to be a general thawing in attitudes at the higher level within UGL in recent years. Is that a reasonable impression, John?
I don't think they even think about it.
Well, they seem to be using women Freemasons a lot more in publicity for UGLE, and we see them in Great Queen Street now in a way that we didn't before.
Yes, sorry, I think they're just using women Freemasons for their own ends.
Right.
I don't think they have any friendlies for them, really.
So I had a question or something I'd be interested in Jim's reflections on, which was there was an important book which got a lot of publicity published by the distinguished 18th century historian Linda Colley last year, called The Gunmanship and the Pen on Constitutions. And she emphasized the importance of written constitutions in the emergence of civil society and saw Anderson's constitutions as actually having an enormous influence there. But her argument was that because of the influence of Anderson, this actually meant that women were locked out of civil society to a degree. And indeed, the quote is from her, says, in Freemasonry, with its close connections with the new political technologies of written constitutions, women were overwhelmingly shut out. And she sees that very much as a function of Freemasonry, which seems to be to run contrary to the work of people like Gue and Margaret Jacob. I wonder whether that's because Linda Colley was approaching it to some degree from an Anglo-centric point of view, and you and Margaret are looking at it much more from a French point of view.
Yeah, you know, we're talking about a worldwide movement, a fraternal organization that has many different manifestations defined, in fact, by cultures from one place to another, in ways that, you know, not all Masons are Masons under the circumstances of how different they are organized and how their rituals are regulated and what it means to be a Mason, a brother, or in this case, a sister. And that diversity, that kind of range of experience in the Masonic community, and I'll call it the community with a lowercase c, makes it very difficult for us to say what goes on in England, however hard the United Grand Lodge of England has tried to serve as the source of leadership of that Masonic worldwide community. It clearly has had lots of pushback. And in the case of France, the Grand Orient of France refused to back off, and continues to refuse to back off. Its denial of any kind of religious suggestion in the rituals, in the lodge's activities, and they're very proud of that.
So
This
yeah,
does not sit well with the UGLE. You know, this is something that they find, and of others find, really difficult to reconcile. And, you know, they're on speaking terms, but clearly Grand Orient Masons are not acceptable in the fullest range of Masonic activities in those lodges overseen by the United Grand Lodge of England, and vice versa. This is
interesting.
A real problem they have to resolve here, and then we won't
No,
be
they
able to really
don't.
get to what the role of women play in all of this until they do. But they found a way to accommodate women in one way or another, and I think the Grand Orient of France has been more sincere about that than the United Grand Lodge of England. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. But of course, in England, it's this matter of the great architect of the universe is not new. The Supreme Council of England back in 1875 was prepared to give it away and throw it out of the window. Oh, yes, they signed up to do it. But they had a big problem because they did that, and the boss of the Supreme Council was the Earl of Carnarvon, and he was also the Grand Master, and he had a real problem, and he was a politician as well, so he had to choose, and he chose to remain Grand Master of UGLE. He stood up to condemn the Grand Orient of France by talking about, 7 times in a speech, a landmark being a belief in God and the immortality of the soul. And you can see him waving his arms when he did it. They took a real beating over this. And actually, they upset Albert Pike, and he was. Oh yes, Albert Pike came over the seas to Edinburgh in September 1877, and he sat in conference with the Supreme Council of Scotland and a guy called Lindsay Mackesy and the Irish, and they eventually they saw off the Supreme Council of England, who had to go back, and the Supreme Council of England went back to being completely and utterly solidly Trinitarian. So we have had moments of absolute madness in England as well.
I was interested in what you were saying, Jim, about Annie Besant, because although the position wasn't sort of sorted out, as you say, until 1957, Annie Besant was very clear from the word go that whatever lodges she found, whatever she set up in England, would have to follow the UGLE recommendation about the Supreme Great Architect of the Universe, and not the French position. And she argued both that was a kind of practical necessity in order not to alienate. Curious, given that her position as a quite prominent secularist advocate, that she was horrified by the aggressive atheism of the French Freemasons, and felt that was horrible, and she didn't want it in anything that she set up. So she set up a situation where the great architect of the universe was there from the word go.
Yeah, I have discussions all the time with my colleagues here and folks in the States, well, outside of France anyway, how to understand the aggressive secularism of French republicanism. It's a long discussion, but it begins with the origins of the Gallican Church and you know, the way an absolute monarchy established in the 1600s, under Louis XIV, you know, one king, one law, one faith. And the role played by, the political role played by some form of church intervention in French politics was constant and unrelenting, quite clearly in ways that made French politics even more unstable than they would ordinarily have been anyway. Such that by the time Pius IX in the 1850s and 60s starts issuing proclamations against modernity, including Freemasonry.
Against women.
Yeah, that's right. Against feminism, socialism, republicanism. I mean, you name it, it's all in there.
And against the railways.
Yeah.
He was not going to have a railway built through the middle of Italy.
Oh, that's great.
Because it would spread evil ideas.
I mean, I read his encyclical, but I didn't see the railroads. But anyway, and then it gets, you know, it festers even more in due time, such that by 1905, France separates church and state with a meat cleaver. For all intents and purposes, claiming all the property that belongs to the church and renting it back to the church for its own purposes. It's not an association like any others, and it's certainly not an association protected under the same laws as Freemasonry. But it's still this rather peculiar, alienated relationship of French politics in a way that is intensified about whether women are allowed to wear burqas to the beach, whether they can, you know, well, whether a Jew can wear a yarmulke going into the post office. I mean, you know, or, you know, a Christian can wear a cross around her neck in a school. This is really incendiary French politics that's still very much alive, and it has this long historical tradition. And so we see this played out in Freemasonry as well.
No, I've argued
variation on clearly is, you know,
well, I've argued in
other places.
I've argued in the past that's a really fundamental thing to bear in mind, both in thinking about the nature of Freemasonry as well as civil society more widely. It contrasts between Anglophone societies and France. In France, you've got this funneling of everything, the secularity funneled through the state, whereas for the reasons to do with the way in which the British state grew, because it absorbed Welsh and its nonconformity, it had to deal with Scotland and its extraordinary nonconformity, and Ireland. Although there's an underlying anti-Catholicism, nevertheless, in Britain, it was necessary for the state to function, for the secularity to be expressed more in terms of tolerance of religion and rejection of atheism.
Tolerance of the Quakers, tolerance of the Methodists, and
but it's better to have. I mean, the view is it's better to have a faith than no faith. That's a very English, British attitude. Whereas in France, you want to get faith completely out of the equation. Really, it's an interesting thing. So, going back to the division between the Masonic split, the great schism in the history of Freemasonry between France and Britain. One of the reasons for the kind of instability around that, Jim, which I find very interesting, is the way in which a lot of the problems were caused by radical secularists and extreme Freemasons who left France after Louis Napoleon's coup in 1851, as well as communards who came over after 1870, who settled in mostly London, but also the Channel Islands, and were all Freemasons and sort of thought they could pitch up to an English Lodge of Freemasons and all would be well, and were horrified by what they encountered. And that was one of the reasons that sort of created the instability between London and Paris in the Masonic regime. The big French periodical that's still published by Grand Orient, Chaîne d'Union, was actually founded in Islington, so it started off as production of London emigres. So there was this kind of problem that the French refugees were feeding back to Paris this line that English Freemasonry was directed by the Anglican clergy and was devoted to the study of gourmandise, as they put it. And this sort of brought the French instability that you described so well over into Britain, and partly accounts for all the problems that John's described in the difficulties around the 1870s. But my question to Jim on that, sorry, there was a comment rather than a question. Have you found any evidence of women Freemasons coming over from France to London at that point? Because there must have been women exiles after Louis Napoleon took power.
Yes, one of the interesting characters I've followed up in a little bit more detail is Louise Michel, who was a communist, major figure on the barricades, who came to Freemasonry just a year or two before she died. This in the early 1900s. She joined two lodges, the Droit Humain and Raison Triomphante in the Grand Symbolique Scottish Rite Lodge. And it's interesting, when you read her memoirs and some of her correspondence, she says, "I have always wanted to be a Mason. If I knew that women could have anything to do with it, I just assumed it was always for men." She didn't say anything about religion, didn't say anything about, what had transpired earlier in what we know about Masonry, at least Freemason women, whether or not they were women in Freemasonry is another matter. But, she came to it with a presupposition from her years in exile in Britain that made it an illumination for her when she returned to France after her exile from both in New Caledonia and then, of course, several years in London, that where she was clearly aware of who was a Mason and who wasn't a Mason, figuring that she wasn't really part of it, and then surprised to find out that, sure enough, that there was room for her and it didn't require any religious affiliation.
That's very interesting. So, because the Philadelphs, who were the active Masonic body that has this huge communard component in it after the 1870s, are very active in providing social facilities for French emigres. And that would seem to imply that they didn't give any prominence to women's involvement in that. That's really interesting.
Yep.
It would have all been different had Thomas Dunkerley just lived a little bit longer. It's true. Because when I was writing my book on Thomas Dunkerley, I found that towards the end of his life, he was trying to create basically an English version of what emerged in the Carolinas as the Scottish Rite. And he was flirting with the idea of lodges for women. Maybe more than flirting. But he died, so that didn't happen.
Part of the issue from the point of view of English, and it's interesting again, the comparison with France, from the point of view of people thinking about Britain, is that our focus is so much on, as it were, official lodges. And there are probably these lodges meeting in rooms all over London and elsewhere that we know very little about, which may be...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, folks, have we... Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just make me one last comment here that I would like to pick up and then drop just 30 seconds. Clearly, what Masonry is and has been is in large response to what others have perceived of it. It's a really constraining, contextual perspective that I think we need to keep in mind. That what Masons think and know is not what others think and know or think they know about Masonry. That there's a social imaginary And the split between the social imaginary, between Masons on the one hand and the world around Masonry on the other, is sometimes, you know, kind of a tense interchange, a kind of dysfunctional relationship. And I have to say, this idea of perceptions about what it means to be a Mason varies over time and in context, from culture to culture. And we need to keep mindful of this as we try to sort of get a handle on some of these issues about the role of religion, on the role of women, and of transgender, and all sorts of other political matters that Masonry has had to wrestle with in one way or another over the last 300 years.
John, did you want to have the last word?
Oh, I'd just like to go back to 1750, because I felt that perhaps the ladies were being, the lady Masons were being somewhat disparaged, and they weren't doing the real thing. I think they bloody well were, because there was an adoption lodge in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And in 1750, they sent one of their members, one William Mitchell, who taught English, over to London to get a warrant for the Heraldom of Kilwinning. But it took him so long, and it was a long time before he got back, that they decided they weren't waiting. They'd settled for the Scots Master instead. So they went down to France and got the Écossais. Now, that to me says that these women, this adoption lodge, was doing more than just giving lip service to it. They were taking Masonry very seriously at the cutting edge of higher degrees. It's just another point, I think.
All right, Okan, shall I wrap this up? Are you still there? Yes,
Go
you were
ahead,
still
please.
there.
Yep.
Are we done?
Yep, for today.
I
You're done,
think.
Susan. Thank you.
Jim, thank you so much.
Indeed,
And
thank you.
everyone else, thank you. Andrew, John, thank you so much. And hi, Reva, do you want to say something, or are you just being friendly? I don't know. She raised her. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
So everybody,
Bye.
bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.